Imagine that your child is accused of something serious unjustly, in a place where he should only be having fun. This is the pain that Ezra feels as he sees his son Kale being accused of theft in a toy store. The shame, the fear, the feeling of helplessness. All of this comes to the surface in an instant. How would you react if you were in his place? And more. How would you cope upon discovering an unexpected truth that completely changes the situation? In this video, we will show you how a simple intervention from a father transformed not only an unfounded accusation, but also how everyone involved learned a powerful lesson about judgment, empathy, and humility. You will discover that, often, what we see is not exactly what it seems. Get ready for a story that will move you and perhaps help you reflect on your own attitudes in daily life. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and share your opinion. Kale was only 8 years old, but he carried within him the curiosity and fascination of an explorer. On that sunny day, his mother took him to the downtown area, where the big toy store shone like a castle of dreams. As soon as his little feet crossed the glass door, something inside him awakened, a joy almost impossible to contain. His large, lively eyes roamed every aisle, but it was the display case at the back of the store that captured his attention like a magnet. There, right in front of him, lay the object of his dreams, a red and black remote-controlled car, with silver details, sparkling under the light of the shelves. The car seemed capable of reaching speeds that Kale had only seen in movies, gliding across the floor with elegance. His heart raced. He could imagine the control in his hands, feeling the power of guiding that car through the streets of his imagination. He moved closer, almost pressing his face against the glass of the display case, analyzing every detail. It was the kind of toy that not only made children dream but also brought those dreams to life. With each second spent there looking, he wished he could have it. But Kale knew from experience that he couldn't ask his father for that. They had already discussed the need to save money and how expensive toys were out of reach at the moment. The boy was aware of this, but the desire remained strong in his heart. Kale didn't want the car to show off or to compete with his peers. His desire was simple, almost innocent. He wanted to create moments, live adventures, explore the speed and control that car could offer. He imagined racing around the yard, dodging obstacles, creating a world where the car was the protagonist of his adventures. Admiration was etched on his face. He touched the glass with the tips of his fingers, as if that would bring him closer to his desire. With each second standing there watching, Kale wondered what it would be like if that car were his, how he would make it race down the streets and sidewalks. Deep in his heart he knew that dream was distant, but for now watching was enough. But at that moment, Kale did not realize that a store employee was watching him from afar, with a suspicious expression. As Kale continued to gaze at the car, completely absorbed in that world of possibilities, something strange began to happen without his noticing. Behind the counter, Morrow, one of the employees, kept his eyes fixed on the boy. Morrow had worked there for many years, and as someone who dealt with all kinds of customers daily, his trained eye quickly caught Kale's intense fixation on the toy. Perhaps it was just another child dreaming, but Morrow, with his suspicious nature, felt he should keep an eye on him. Kale, unaware that he was being watched, finally gathered his courage and reached out to grab the car from the shelf. It was an innocent, almost automatic gesture. He just wanted to hold the toy in his hands, feel the weight, take a closer look. After all, in a child's imagination, touch transformed dreams into reality. However, at that moment, his focus was so intense that he did not notice a crucial detail. By picking up the car, he slowly stepped out of the area where the toys were displayed and began to move toward the door, still admiring the object. Morrow, who had approached discreetly, interpreted Kale's movement differently. To him it looked like a clear act of attempted theft. His previous experiences with mischievous children, who occasionally tried to sneak out with toys hidden in their pockets, always kept him on alert. And in his eyes, Kale was no different. "Hey kid!" Morrow's voice cut through the air, with a harsh tone that immediately shattered Kale's bubble of concentration. The boy turned around, startled, not understanding why he was being approached. Morrow quickly approached, arms crossed and an expression heavy with suspicion. "What are you doing with that toy? You were about to leave the store with it, weren't you?" Morrow continued, not giving Kale a chance to respond. The boy, still holding the car in his hands, opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He looked around, realizing that some customers had already begun to pay attention to the scene, which made his cheeks flush with embarrassment. This wasn't the first time Cale had felt this kind of pressure, but this time was different. He only wanted to admire the car, nothing more than that. But now he was standing there in front of everyone, being unjustly accused. The weight of the car in his hands felt doubled, and his eyes began to shine with unshed tears. Morrow did not relent, standing firm. "You were going to steal it, weren't you? You can confess. Why didn't you leave the toy on the shelf?" The harshness of his words seemed to crush Cale, who shook his head in denial. I just wanted to see it up close," Cale finally managed to murmur, his voice trembling and almost inaudible. Morrow, however, did not seem convinced. The scene was about to escalate further, with curious glances and whispers spreading throughout the store. The air was charged with tension, and Cale felt cornered, as if the weight of all the accusations was more than he could bear. And at that moment, when everything seemed lost, the store door opened and Ezra, Cale's father, walked in, noticing the commotion from a distance. Morrow could not take his eyes off Cale. To him it was as clear as day. The boy was trying to leave with the car without paying. He had seen this scene before, and unfortunately, he knew that, in some situations, children were used by adults to commit thefts. But what he did not know was that this time, the case was very different. As Morrow approached, his raised voice began to attract the attention of other people in the store. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he questioned, with the authority of someone who had already resolved the situation in his mind. Cale, surprised and scared, froze in place, still holding the car in his small hands. His innocent mind could not comprehend what was happening. The sparkle in his eyes, which had once been pure admiration for the toy, was now replaced by a look of confusion and fear. I just wanted to look," Cale murmured, but Morrow, already furious at the thought that someone might be trying to steal from his store, did not listen. He made a wide gesture with his arm, drawing even more attention. Now, other customers stopped to watch, and the once quiet store suddenly became the stage for an uncomfortable scene. "Oh, you just wanted to look, right? And you were almost walking out the door with the toy in your hand. That's not how you look at a toy, kid," Morrow continued, his voice rising with each sentence. His accusation was laden with impatience that Cale didn't know how to face. The boy could only look down, feeling the weight of all those curious, and to him judgmental stares. Some people whispered among themselves, and the murmurs only worsened Cale's discomfort. His eyes began to water. He could not understand why he was being treated this way. Deep down, he only wanted to see the toy up close. There was no malice, no intention to steal, but everything around him now seemed to conspire against him. Morrow, arms crossed, awaited an explanation for the boy's behavior, but all Cale could do was shake his head, timid tears beginning to trickle down his face. The boy, who just a few minutes earlier had been daydreaming about the car, was now the center of a public accusation. The feeling of shame consumed him, making every second in that store unbearable. An older customer, observing from a distance, made a low comment, which only heightened Cale's embarrassment. He looked at the toy in his hands, and what had once been a symbol of fun and joy now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. He didn't know what to say or how to defend himself. His words were lost amid all that confusion, and increasingly, he wished he could disappear, vanish from that place. The tension in the air grew, and Morrow, still incredulous at the boy's silence, was about to call security. But suddenly a familiar voice echoed through the store. It was Ezra's firm voice, Cale's father, who had just arrived and seen the scene from afar. His gaze immediately met his son's, and without hesitation, he began to walk quickly toward Morrow and Cale, ready to intervene. In the midst of all the confusion, when Cale already felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, the store doors opened and Ezra walked in. His gaze was immediately drawn to the scene unfolding near the exit. He saw his son with red, tear-filled eyes, being confronted by an employee, while some people around murmured and watched with curiosity. Ezra's heart raced. He knew something was wrong. Without hesitation, he walked quickly toward the group, his face tense and his expression worried. When he got closer, he could hear Morrow's last words, still accusing Cale of attempted theft. Ezra, despite the tension he felt, remained calm. He needed to understand what was happening before reacting. "Excuse me," Ezra interrupted, with a firm but controlled tone. "This is my son, Cale. What is happening here?" Morrow, with his arms still crossed, took a step back, but his severe gaze did not lessen. "Your son was trying to leave the store with a toy without paying. He was almost past the store area with the car in his hands." Ezra turned to Cale, bending down to be at his son's height, trying to calm him with his presence. He could see how shaken Cale was. The boy wiped his tears with the sleeve of his shirt. His voice choked with the fear and shame he felt. "Dad, I just wanted to see the car up close. I didn't know I had crossed the area. I didn't want to steal." Hearing his son's words made Ezra's heart ache. He knew Cale would never do something like that on purpose. Cale was a curious boy, yes, but above all, he was kind and well-mannered. Ezra held Cale's shoulder firmly, conveying reassurance. "Cale, I believe in you," Ezra said gently, enough for his son to feel his father's support. Then he stood up, turning to Morrow. "Look, I understand that you're just doing your job, but my son wasn't trying to steal. He just got distracted like any child would. He loves cars and got excited. This is a misunderstanding." Morrow looked at Ezra, still trying to process the situation. The expression on the employee's face, which had previously been one of complete distrust, began to soften slowly. He still appeared somewhat suspicious, but upon seeing the sincerity in Ezra's eyes and Cale's vulnerability, something inside him shifted. I just wanted to make sure nothing wrong was happening," Morrow replied, now in a quieter tone, almost justifying himself. Ezra's firm and calm presence was changing the course of the situation. The tense atmosphere in the store began to dissipate. The customers, who had been watching the scene curiously, also seemed to relax. Some moved away, realizing that this wasn't the scandal they had anticipated. Others, still interested, lingered nearby, as if waiting for a more satisfactory resolution. Ezra looked at Morrow one last time with understanding. "I understand your side, but I assure you that Cale would never do this with malicious intent. Can we resolve this without further embarrassment for him?" Morrow, still somewhat uncomfortable with the situation, took a deep breath and finally nodded. The misunderstanding seemed to be resolved, but what happened next was something Morrow could never have imagined. Morrow, still immersed in his distrust, didn't seem willing to listen to Ezra. "Sorry, but the situation is clear. He was about to leave the store with the car, and that is theft no matter how you look at it. If you're not here to do something about it, I will need to call security," he insisted, looking at Cale with an expression that mixed coldness and determination. Cale, already shrunk in on himself, clutched the bag of toys he was holding, feeling his heart race. Ezra, realizing that the situation could escalate even further, took a deep breath to calm himself. He knew he needed to act quickly but also wisely. For him, it was essential to prove his son's innocence, not just to resolve the misunderstanding but to protect Cale's self-esteem. With a steady gesture, he began to search for something in the pocket of his jacket. While all eyes were on him, Ezra pulled out a small, colorful paper bag, which stood out against the tense atmosphere. He looked at Cale, who was still pale and scared. "Cale, sweetheart, do you remember this bag?" he asked, trying to bring a little comfort to the boy. Cale, still not fully understanding what was happening, looked at the bag and slowly nodded, his eyes full of curiosity. "Yes, Daddy. I bought some things at the store," he replied timidly, unaware that this was the very moment that could change everything. Ezra began to open the bag, revealing a collection of new toys, each one more fascinating than the last. Among them, prominently displayed, was the coveted remote-controlled car that Cale had spotted in the window. The sparkle in the boy's eyes began to return, but there was still a cloud of uncertainty hanging over him. "This car here," Ezra said, holding it carefully, "Cale bought with his savings a few weeks ago. He saved his money for months, and when he finally had enough, he came here to buy what he truly wanted. He is a responsible boy and always thinks twice before spending every penny." The gazes of the customers, which had previously been filled with curiosity, now turned to Morrow, who looked perplexed and speechless. Ezra continued, "Here are the receipts from the purchases if you want to see. He did all of this on his own. I taught him to value money and to be patient. Morrow looked at the car in his hands, then at the receipts that Ezra had pulled from the bag, his face slowly changing from skepticism to confusion. He ran his hand through his hair, feeling increasingly embarrassed by the accusation he had made. How could he have thought that such a young child, who was so excited to be in a toy store, could be a thief? I didn't know, Morrow murmured, now with a quiet voice, almost ashamed. He looked at Cale, who was beginning to regain his confidence, wiping away the tears that were still streaming down his face. I'm sorry, kid. I really thought you were trying to steal. I didn't mean to put you in a situation like this. Cale, with his eyes still shining, felt a mix of relief and a bit of apprehension. It's okay, he said in a delicate voice. I just wanted to see up close. The atmosphere in the store began to change. The murmuring of the customers around them was replaced by a reflective silence as the situation unfolded. Ezra, now relieved, saw Morrow's expression soften. The tension in the air was palpable, but understanding was beginning to blossom between the two. Ezra decided that it was time to bring a more positive resolution to everything, without letting the situation ruin anyone's day. With that, he made the decision to propose something that could not only help Morrow, but also show Cale that kindness can be more powerful than accusation. Ezra, always calm and serene, took a light breath and with a comforting smile, looked into Morrow's eyes. Look, Morrow, what you didn't know is that Cale has a special relationship with this toy. He saved for months to buy it, and what he was doing here today was just comparing the model he already has with the new one on the shelf. It's not difficult for a child to be curious, wanting to see up close to feel the difference. He never intended to steal. Morrow, who had been rigid until that moment, as if defending an undeniable position, began to soften. His eyes fixed on the floor, and he felt crushed by his own accusation. The silence in the air was uncomfortable. The customers who had previously been whispering to each other were now just watching the scene attentively, feeling the weight of the situation. The employee who had so often believed he was right, now realized that the mistake was his. And it wasn't just any mistake. He had exposed an innocent boy to embarrassment, and this realization hit him hard. Cale, still wide-eyed and curious, stood beside his father. He was no longer crying, but the confusion was still there. Ezra knelt down, leveling his height with Cale's, and hugged him. Everything is going to be okay, son, he whispered lovingly, stroking the boy's hair. You didn't do anything wrong. As the silence became unbearable, Morrow, overwhelmed by shame, finally lifted his eyes and looked at Ezra and Cale. I'm sorry, he said with a low voice full of regret. I really thought you were trying to steal, Cale. I was wrong, and there's no way to erase what I did. Forgive me for putting you in this situation. The father, always understanding, knew that this was an important opportunity, not only for the employee but also to teach something valuable to his son. He extended his hand, offering a friendly handshake to Morrow. We all make mistakes, said Ezra, with a firm yet gentle voice. What matters is to acknowledge and learn from them. Morrow, astonished, accepted the handshake. It was something he hadn't expected after everything that had happened. He looked at Cale, who was beside his father, and not knowing what else to do, offered a shy and sincere smile to the boy. Cale, still processing everything, responded with a light but genuine smile. It's okay, he said, with the simplicity of a child who still believes that the world can be set right with an apology. Morrow, grateful for the understanding and humility of Ezra and Cale, committed to making the experience more positive for the boy. You know, Cale, Morrow said, the store will receive new models of remote-controlled cars next week. If you'd like, I can help you choose one. It would be the least I could do. Cale looked at his father, and Ezra nodded, approving Morrow's offer. With a new sense of lightness in the atmosphere, the employee stepped away to assist other customers, but the lesson in humility he had learned at that moment would echo in his mind for a long time. Ezra held Cale's hand, and together they walked toward the store exit. See, son, Ezra said, gently squeezing the boy's hand. Sometimes people make mistakes, but we can always choose how to respond to them. What matters is to move forward with a clear heart. Cale smiled, feeling that something important had changed that day. He not only understood the value of his achievements, but also learned that patience and forgiveness can transform even the most difficult moments. And so, father and son left the store, leaving behind not only the misunderstanding, but also a lesson about empathy and growth. The store manager, Mr. Ricardo, watched the situation from a distance and, noticing the emotional conclusion, felt compelled to intervene. He quickly walked over to where Ezra and Cale were, his face laden with remorse. "Please accept my sincere apologies," the manager began, his voice low yet firm. "What happened here should not have happened, and Morrow has already been advised. Cale, you should not have been treated this way, and we want to make amends for this mistake." Cale looked at the manager with his big eyes, still a bit scared but now full of curiosity. The boy, still holding his father's hand, listened attentively as the manager continued. "As a way to show our regret, we would like to offer you a new toy, any one you want. It's a gift from the store to you." There was a moment of silence in the air, as if the world was waiting for the boy's response. Cale looked at the remote-controlled car on the shelf, the same one that had fascinated him from the beginning. He could take it home without spending a dime. After all, it was the toy of his dreams. But something inside him felt different now. Perhaps it was what his father had said about how people make mistakes, or maybe it was the silent lesson that the things we value most are those we fight for. Cale took a deep breath and with a surprising calmness for someone his age replied, "Thank you, but I never wanted anything for free. I just wanted to dream a little." His words, simple and sincere, resonated like a lesson for everyone around. There was no anger or resentment in his voice, just the purity of someone who, even at a young age, already understood the value of effort. Those few words touched the hearts of all present. The manager, visibly moved, smiled at Cale at a loss for words. What could be said after such a pure demonstration of character? Ezra, proud of his son, ran his hand through the boy's hair and said, "You have a big heart, Cale. The greatest gift you can have is to continue believing in your dreams." Cale smiled at his father, feeling lighter and more confident. He realized that this moment was not about the toy but something much bigger. It was about understanding that sometimes what truly matters is not what we have in our hands, but what we carry in our hearts. The manager, touched by Cale's wisdom, placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "You are raising an amazing boy," he said. Few children or even adults would have the same reaction. Ezra simply smiled in response, knowing that this moment was one of those that would be etched forever in Cale's memory, and in his as well. As they prepared to leave the store, Cale looked at the remote-controlled car one last time, but this time with a different sense of satisfaction. He knew that sooner or later he would get what he wanted, and when that happened it would be through his own merit. As they crossed the door, father and son left behind not only the store but also a lesson in humility, empathy, and perseverance. Upon stepping through the store's doors, the afternoon felt calmer, almost as if the air was lighter. The noise of people inside the store and the bustle of the street outside now seemed distant to Cale and his father, Ezra. As they walked, the father gently squeezed Cale's hand, keeping his gaze firmly ahead, but with something more in his eyes, a glimmer of pride, but also the certainty that this was an opportunity for a valuable lesson. "Cale," Ezra began with a calm and steady voice, "what happened in there was a difficult situation, but what matters most is what we learn from it." Cale looked at his father, still trying to process everything that had happened. He still felt the lightness of relief that everything had turned out well, but the confusion lingered. "I didn't understand, Dad. Why did Morrow think I was doing something wrong?" asked the boy, his innocence evident. Ezra took a deep breath, knowing this was the right moment to teach something Cale would carry for a lifetime. "Sometimes people see what they want to see," Ezra explained as they walked side by side. "Morrow didn't know you. He didn't know your intentions, and instead of trying to understand what was really happening, he acted based on what he thought he knew. And that, Cale, can happen to any of us." Cale, always curious, continued to listen attentively. "But he was wrong, Dad. I just wanted to look at the car up close." "Yes, he was wrong," replied Ezra, stopping and bending down to be at his son's eye level. "And that's why we should never judge someone by appearances. Before jumping to any conclusions, we need to try to understand the person, what they are thinking, what they are feeling." Morrow let prejudice speak louder, and made a judgment without knowing the truth. Cale fell silent, reflecting on his father's words. He knew that what had happened in the store was more than just a misunderstanding about a toy. There was something deeper there, something that made him feel responsible not only for himself but also for how he would treat others in the future. Meanwhile, inside the store, Morrow was also reflecting on the events. He had returned to his post, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed each moment in his head. Cale's frightened look, Ezra's calm tone, the revelation of the already purchased toy. It hit him hard. Morrow had never thought much about the impact of his actions on others. He believed he was merely doing his job, but now he realized he had judged an innocent child based on hasty assumptions. The weight of regret bore down on him. How could I have been so blind? Morrow thought as he watched the customers coming in and out of the store. He had always thought that to do his job well, he needed to be strict and not hesitate to act. But now he saw that true strength lay in knowing when to pause, reflect, and understand before taking action. I could have caused immense harm to that boy, to his trust, to how he sees people, he concluded, his chest tightening. And it was at that moment that Morrow decided something needed to change. He had learned an important lesson, that pride, prejudice, and the rush to judge could distort reality and lead to painful mistakes. For him, that day would become a turning point. Morrow knew he would never look at someone the same way again without first trying to see beyond appearances. As Cale and Ezra continued their way back home, the boy, now calmer, looked at his father with an expression of understanding. I won't forget this, Dad. I will always try to understand people before I think I know what they are doing. Ezra smiled, proud of the wisdom his son was acquiring at such an early age. That's the most important thing, my son. If we all do this, the world will be a better place. With a light heart and a new perspective on the world, Cale felt stronger. He knew that despite the confusion, something good had come from that experience. Now he not only had a father who protected him, but also a greater understanding of what it means to be fair and compassionate. And so as the sun began to set, illuminating the path back home, father and son knew that that day, marked by a difficult moment, would become a precious memory, not for the shame or fear, but for the lasting lesson they would carry forever. The end of the story? No. Just the beginning of a wiser, more empathetic Cale, and of a transformed Morrow, who would do everything he could to never make the same mistake again. The unexpected return to the store. Days after the incident, Cale and Ezra decided to return to the store. It wasn't a planned visit, but a simple pass nearby awakened in Cale the desire to revisit the place where something important had happened. Upon entering, the atmosphere felt different, but one thing caught their attention. Morrow, the employee who had made the mistake, was reorganizing the shelves with a more serene expression. When Morrow saw them, something changed in his face. He approached Cale and Ezra, but this time with a look of humility and gratitude. I was hoping you would come back, said Morrow with a firm voice, but with a touch of vulnerability. That day taught me a lot. I wanted to thank you, especially you, Cale, for giving me the chance to learn from my mistake. Cale, still feeling the strangeness of the situation, looked at his father for support, but Ezra just smiled, encouraging him to respond. It's okay, Cale said timidly. Everyone makes mistakes. I just hope you understand that things aren't always as they seem. Morrow nodded with a slight and sincere smile. I understand, yes, and I promise I will be more careful. Today I am a better employee and I hope a better person. This brief exchange of words sealed something important. It was not just the end of a complicated situation, but the beginning of a new relationship. Cale left the store feeling that sometimes even bad moments can turn into something good, if we are willing to forgive and learn. The shared lesson. A few weeks later, during a family dinner, Ezra shared the story of what had happened in the store with close relatives. While the children listened with wide eyes, the adults reflected in silence. Each had their own experiences of hasty judgments and misunderstandings, but the way Ezra and Cale handled that situation touched everyone. Cale's mother, Isabella, looked at her son with pride. You learned something very important, my love. Not all adults have the capacity to forgive and understand as you did. Cale smiled, fiddling with the food on his plate, unsure how to respond to such praise. Deep down, he was still processing everything that had happened. But one thing he knew. The lesson he learned that day in the store was one he would carry for a lifetime. And now, seeing his family reflect on it, he realized that his experience had the power to impact others, even without him saying much. At the end of that night, as the children were getting ready for bed, Ezra approached Cale in his room and said, "The lesson you learned, son, goes beyond us. You will share this with others, even without realizing it, just by the way you treat people." And with that, Cale closed his eyes, falling asleep with a heart full of wisdom and, above all, a new understanding of how the world works. Not always just, but always ready to teach. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect, don't forget to leave your comment and share your experiences. We want to know how you deal with situations of judgment and forgiveness. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more exciting stories like this one. Hit the bell to receive notifications and be the first to check out our next video.